Well, we're about a little more than 24 hours into this story from Virginia. Allison Parker and Adam Ward of WDBJ Channel 7, a CBS affiliate, were conducting an interview when shots were fired. The incident was caught on camera. A person being interviewed was also sent to the hospital, but the two journalists were killed. The shooter later took his own life. Here to talk more about journalists and the dangerous situations they can be in and post-traumatic stress is an associate professor of journalism at the University of Kansas, Barbara Barnett, who has conducted research on post-traumatic stress disorder and journalists who cover violence and dangerous situations. Thank you for your time today, Professor Barnett.
Thanks for having me.
I think from the outset, from a journalist perspective, the most jarring part about this was that it wasn't a normal, risky situation. Journalists typically understand the risk, but this wasn't the case at all, was it?
No, typically journalists are what we often call first responders, like police, like firemen, and when everybody else is running from a scene, they're running toward it. And so journalists often expect that they're going to be covering a violent situation. They're going to a fire or they're going into combat. And this wasn't the case at all. This was a kind of happy story, and journalists became victims of violence. So no one was prepared.
And the notion that it was live as it happened, that had to have an added impact, I think, not only on the people who watched it, but the fellow journalists who are covering it or have seen it since that time.
I think that's true, because a lot of times when you hear that a journalist was killed doing his or her work, you hear about it after the fact. You don't see it happening on live television.
Yeah, and this typically doesn't happen in America. I don't have statistics in front of me. I know the Poynter Institute has a list of, I think, journalists that have been killed, and a lot of them are overseas. It doesn't happen in America typically.
Right. Typically, when journalists die, they die in a country that's very unsafe. Like a lot of journalists died in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, now in Syria. We don't think of journalists dying in the United States. It's a fairly safe place for journalists to be. But we do have more gun violence than most countries. So the fact that these people were journalists, they could have been teachers, they could have been sports figures, they could have been politicians. So, again, the United States is a safe place for journalists, just not a very safe place from gun violence.
Now, I wanted to get your thoughts on the local affiliate there, WDBJ, on how they handled it. From your perspective, some of your thoughts on, of course, as it happened, but then they continued to proceed in covering the event. They certainly had, I think, the ability to shut down and kind of begin a mourning process, but it seems like they took on the duty of reporting the news. I wanted to get your thoughts on that immediacy of continuing with the job, especially when the tragedy was so close to home. It was in their newsroom.
Yeah, it's hard when anyone you know dies, and then if you're a journalist, you're kind of expected to not be very emotional while this is going on. I was talking with one of my former students last night who is a television reporter, and one of the things that she said was that people get very attached to on-air personalities. You almost feel like you know them, even if you don't, or maybe you've seen them in town, so you feel kind of connected to them. So I think the TV station did the very best job it could, because it was kind of grieving with the community. Mm-hmm. And there's often talk about journalists being the chorus, like the Greek chorus, and kind of asking or the questions that we in the public can't ask right away, or telling us things that we need to know. And I think that's what you saw here, is that they were very emotional, and that's fine, but they did keep going and say, we want to tell you everything we know about the story because we know you and the public will be concerned.
Yeah, I felt that there was certainly that sense of duty that they felt compelled to continue to do which I can't imagine in the wake of this tragedy. Again, we're talking with Barbara Barnett, associate professor of journalism here at the University of Kansas on 1320 KLWN. Depend on it. How do you think other newsrooms are handling this? This hits close to home for a lot of other markets that, there's similar situations where they have, a close-knit community, young reporters, small. I don't know how big the market is that they are working in, but there's probably a lot of other newsrooms that are just like this one that experienced this tragedy.
Yeah, I think one thing that a lot of the research on journalists and post-traumatic stress shows is that journalists don't feel entitled to grieve if they are covering a school shooting. they feel like, well, okay, yes, the family members and the relatives should grieve. Or if they go into combat and someone that they know is shot and killed, they think, yes, they're entitled to grieve. But journalists really believe they're supposed to be detached. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times they just feel like, well, I have to keep going on, and the news is not going to stop, as yesterday we found out when the station stayed on the air. But I think one of the things that newsrooms can do is think about how can you help people after a crisis like this, and how can you help them make sense of what they saw. I was talking with a journalist recently who has covered a lot of homicides, and one of the things that he said was that someone from his human resources department came to him and said, we've really noticed you have a lot of stories about murder, and maybe you'll want to talk to a counselor at some point, so just let us know. So I think newsrooms will take a look at, are there any security precautions they could have taken, mm-hmm. and maybe not. But I think what they can do is think about how can we help the people who are surviving go on. And like I said, feel some comfort, make sense out of it, and not just repress those emotions, but just acknowledge, this is awful, and now I have to go back and do my job.
And could that lead to eventual burnout? I know journalists typically have as high a burnout rates maybe as any other profession out there.
I think so, because I think that with journalists, you often are just chronicling other people's tragedies. Right. In this case, this is a tragedy for the people who worked at this station. But it can lead to burnout. And journalists, like I said, often don't acknowledge that. And they think, well, this isn't supposed to happen to me. I was just a witness to it. I'm not entitled to feel sad about it, but they are. And so it is. I was talking with a friend who covered several wars, and I said, did you ever have anything like post-traumatic stress? And he said, no, I never did. And I said, did you know anybody who did? And he said, no. And he said, but I did have this one guy that was a friend of mine, and he drank a lot, and he got divorced 2 or 3 times, and he had a lot of drug problems, and he had a lot of nightmares. And those are symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes journalists don't feel they're that it can actually affect them. They don't know how to name it. And in a case like this where you've been affected by a murder, journalists will really need to talk to each other, to talk to counselors. And I've had journalists tell me, well, I'm really afraid to do that because if the managers or the editors find out, they'll pull me off the story, and I really want to stay on the story. So like I said, there's this myth that journalists, in trying to be objective, journalists think that often means they have to be unemotional, and that's not necessarily true. You can maybe be emotional off camera and go ahead and do your job, but you still need to acknowledge this was really bad, and it's going to take me a while to get past this.
Is post-traumatic stress, is that you consider that underdiagnosed perhaps in this industry?
I think so. And what will often happen is that journalists will just say, I'm tired of this, and I'm leaving, mm-hmm. And so it's not like people sit around and talk about post-traumatic stress for journalists. And like I said, it's not something journalists even recognize they have, even though they may have some of the same symptoms as people who are firefighters or policemen.
And the military as well,
yeah.
Again, we're talking with Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Kansas, Barbara Barnett, here on KLWN, talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and journalists who cover violence, and a rare case yesterday where the reporters kind of became the story. I wanted to ask you, as the new school year starts at KU, as we have new future journalists coming in and new journalists about to go out from the university, is there a teaching moment in any of this that just happened? Is there a teaching moment at all, or is this simply a tragedy that you can't really explain further? I don't know.
No, I think one of the things that journalism schools often think about, and probably need to think about more, is what happens when reporters do see something violent, and how do you cover that in a way that's sensitive for family members and friends, so that you're getting the information but you don't feel intrusive. And then what do you do with that once that happens? I was talking with another journalist recently who had covered the school shootings in Sandy Hook, and she keeps saying, I don't think I'll ever get over it. And she keeps covering these kinds of things, but she's just not sure that she's going to be able to stay in this profession. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we've talked about is, did you get any training in journalism school about this? And she said no. So a lot of times if reporters are going into an unsafe situation, like overseas, they're going to combat, there will be training programs. When they come back, not as much help. But I think for journalists who are working on domestic stories here in the U.S., they don't always think about it. So I think that one of the things journalism schools can do is help the media portray shootings in a really sensitive way for family members and friends, but to also acknowledge, this is hard for me. There's an organization in New York called the DART organization that provides information for journalists who have covered trauma, and there's information on its website about that kind of says other people are going through this too, and here are some ways you can cope with it.
Barbara, I want to thank you for your time. We just have a few minutes left. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with on this incident from yesterday?
I am doing some research with a colleague at the University of Toronto. He's a psychiatrist, I'm a journalist, and we are doing some studies about what help, if any, news organizations offer reporters who've covered violent situations. We're looking at reporters not just in combat, but people, for instance, who covered Hurricane Katrina, where you see a lot of tragedy. And in the coming months, we're going to be taking a look at that and making some recommendations to news organizations about how they can improve things, and then kind of sharing best practices with news organizations to show what's really going well.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, trauma can come in many forms. It can be criminal, but it can also be natural disasters that can create quite a bit of anxiety.
Yeah, like I said, I've talked with a lot of reporters about this, and I remember one of them going into Haiti and saying that was her worst experience. And she covered crime in Miami and had seen a lot of dead bodies and a lot of tragedy. But she said when she went to Haiti and covered the earthquake, that was the hardest for her, because all of a sudden there were just so many people who were hurting, and there was this feeling of helplessness, and there's nothing I can do. And I'm sure that's some of what the journalists at the station in Roanoke are going through, which is just, I don't know what to do. And there's always survivor guilt. It could have been me. Why did I live and this person didn't? So again, journalists really need, does anybody who's witnessed a violent act like this, really need to think about it's okay to get counseling and get help and talk with each other, and just have somebody that you can talk with, a clergyman, you can talk with somebody else who's been through a similar experience, and it really, that's a good thing, because you want to go on and do your job, and you're not going to be able to do your job well if you're still kind of hurting by something you've seen.
And the support systems from the other journalists out there. It's a close-knit society in a way. I have a colleague in Wichita, Kansas, who announced that they are sending workers, they are a CBS affiliate, they're sending a team of people over to help WDBJ in any way they can, at least from a logistic perspective, so the people close to it can perhaps get some time to themselves maybe. So I can see that. I can see even other affiliates in that market helping out and just kind of putting down the walls of any competition and trying to support each other behind what they do and what they stand for in the journalism world.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that very often what happens if a journalist covers a violent event, they just go back to the office and they're the only one who saw it. With this, it affected the whole newsroom.
Yes.
So they are going to be able to support each other a lot and help each other because they're all grieving together. So it's a little bit different from sometimes when you have an isolated case and you're the only one who was at the crime scene or the only one who covered the tornado. And so, like I said, and I think you're making a good point that other journalists are going to try and pitch in and help as much as they can.
Yeah, a very tragic situation, and we continue to learn more about. I want to thank you for your time. Again, Barbara Barnett, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Kansas. Thank you so much, and all the best here in this semester.
Thank you so much.
All right. This is 1320 K.